I really wish we had made the real movie. Barry Morrow's original script was rich, and it was layered, and it was fair. I mean, in my opinion, it wasn't like they were trying to be in any way disrespectful of the Carpenter family. They were telling a complex story.
I had one phone conversation with Ed Leffler, who was the former manager of the Carpenters, and he advised me that it was going to be tough sledding, and I might think twice about doing it. But he was, gracious and wished me good luck, and I needed it. I didn't have enough of it. But you know what? I also didn't have allegiances, except to the question of why did Karen die? That's how I saw my job, is to kind of solve a mystery. And I didn't, and no one ever will. No, I think the more compassionate we are about not just Karen and her life, but the people around her and her family. I've lived long enough now to understand what Agnes was trying to protect. It was the good standing of the family, the reputation, the pride, and they had riches. They didn't need anything. All she wanted to do is, keep their good name. And then this happened. And she was very defensive, as I've said before, and it stuns people when I tell them that the first thing she said to me when I rang their doorbell was, "I want you to know that I did not kill my daughter." And that was an odd way of inviting me into the home. But I never forgot it, that, she touched on the thing that she was most wounded by, the accusations. And Richard, like any good son, you protect your sister if you can, but you always protect your mom. Richard was just so good at such a young age that, I'm not surprised that Agnes, his mother, did not, dote on him and champion him, and Karen came along and wasn't, any match for him. He cast a really big shadow for a skinny young guy.
Clearly, Richard was always in control of them as a creative team, and Carpenters as a brand. He wrote the music, he found the music, he produced the music. He was responsible. He was and is a musical genius in that way. He created their sound, and he was used to being in control. And ultimately, in filmmaking, it's a collaboration, and there are other influences, and maybe the influences of other people who provided information regarding their life. Perhaps that information wasn't either the way Richard perceived his own family, or perhaps he felt that information was too private and shouldn't be shared.
I think Richard realized that he'd made a big mistake to start this movie to begin with. I think he was scared to death that he was going to sit in the living room with Mom and Dad and watch this play out, and they were just going to get up and walk out of the room and say, "How could you?" Put yourself in that situation. And I think he had every reason to be guarded, but I didn't appreciate it. That wasn't my job. I had my job and he had his job, and that was part of the battle. When he found out that I was talking to Frenda, not just a little, but like virtually all the time, he knew, the game was up, that I knew everything that I needed to and more. And I think I think he also kind of trusted that I had limits, that I understood what was out of bounds. Some people, I think, looked at the making of this movie as a sensationalistic sort of, exploitation of a death. I didn't see it that way. You know, and to find out that so many lives were saved by having it been made, you know, kind of placates me there as well. But he stopped meeting with me, and then I would get his notes, you know, written or by phone or something. And he started to depersonalize our relationship because I think he saw I was entering dangerous waters, and I think if he could have fired me, he would have. And I'm guessing that Jerry Weintraub, or maybe even the network, said no, you know, until the very end.
Richard oversaw everything we did, and I mean, right down to telling me how Karen would hold the microphone, or if she would have laughed or not, you know, what her sense of humor was. Oh no, she wouldn't laugh, or she would laugh, she would have thought that was funny. He was very involved. Every day we got to set, there were new cuts made to the script. We were very aware that the script was being whitewashed. Every day we came to set, there were cuts made to the original piece, and anything that was controversial was being cut and rewritten. So it was clear that the family was uncomfortable that we were exposing anything that put them in a negative light. And I have to believe that Richard was the reason for that. Agnes and Harold weren't on set. But maybe Agnes was reading the script and giving him notes. I would believe that too.
Somebody at the network said that Richard wanted one more meeting with me. And so it was very frank, and it was very businesslike, and it was very helpful. He said, I've done everything I could to get you to, you know, back off of my mother. I understand you think she's the cause of it all, which I did not, but nevertheless, that's how he saw it. He said, I'm willing to do some horse trading. I'm going to tell you something about me that, you know, paints me in a more complete way, maybe takes me off that little pedestal that people might see me on. And but in exchange for that, you've just got to soften some of those hard edges on my mother. I said, I can't make a deal like that. I said, you know, the network can maybe. I said, but I would do my best, you know. I mean, I'm gonna tell them what you tell me. And then they're gonna let me do what I can do. I said, but that's a chance you'll have to take. And they all said, great, put it in and leave the other stuff. You know, don't round her edges off too much. We need that. Well, that's why there was a fifth draft, because Richard didn't get what he wanted, you know, in the deal with me. And I read that fifth draft by another writer, and they just did everything Richard had asked for.
So inevitably, some content had to stay in the film, or else there would be nothing other than a giant montage, right? But I found it interesting that Richard he traded information. He traded his addiction and his treatment for addiction to Quaaludes for content about the women in his family. It's like, you know, at a certain point, you know, no, you can't talk about this, you can't talk about this, and you can't talk about that. So what the heck are you going to talk about? And it was so important that certain information was removed from the story that he was willing to put in something that did not, you know, shed light on him in such a positive way. Although, of course, today, speaking about addiction is terribly important and you know, treated with a great amount of seriousness and respect, right? Our country is in a crisis in terms of addiction. But back then to speak of it was, there's a lot of shame attached. So it was a pretty big deal that Richard was willing to put that part of the story in to substitute other things.
I've really mellowed on my assessment of what happened. I can see now why Richard did exactly what he did. Why the studio did what they did, and what I did. I had no choice, really. The product, despite all the stripping down and whitewashing and then chipping that off and putting a new paint of something on it, despite all that, it came close, as close as we could then, to, I think, getting into her heart and her head. But we also got one more chance to listen to her. And so it was a two-way street, watching and making that movie. It is interesting to consider that when Karen's star rose so fast and went so far, and Richard got eclipsed, and now he was living in the shadow. I think it hurt Agnes more than it did Richard. I think she, not hurt, but she was mystified by it. She'd sort of bet wrong. And I think Richard's ego certainly took a hit. And he developed, some substance abuse issues. Not that those are uncommon in the music business. They would be the only two to never have one, if that were the case. But it was, it's certainly the apple cart was, once again tipped over. Look, was this family some crazy, dysfunctional, nut house that was destroying? No. It was a very normal family. It was Ozzie and Harriet, but they had superstars. And they could come home to Downey, but when they're gone in the day and the night and the road and the countries and all of that, it's not a normal life. They wanted a normal ending, and they got a Hollywood ending.
I can't speculate what Richard thought or thinks. I have heard that he wasn't happy with the production. He had influence over everything, at least for as long as I was involved in it. I don't know what happened in post, but in pre-production and production, Richard was involved every moment of every day. Perhaps in spite of all the whitewashing, the story still showed things that he didn't want to look at in terms of the familial relationships and the influence his mother had on Karen's health. Perhaps. It's not for me to judge. It's fascinating to consider that so much time and money was spent creating this film, and so much authentic material was brought to it, and yet the end result doesn't really tell Karen's story. There's so much under there. If you just consider the top reasons that one becomes anorexic, and you don't have to have all of these, you can have one or all of them, but it's needing to feel in control, not wanting to grow up, perfectionism, not wanting to disappear. Any number of those things, or in combination, can cause someone to go down this fatal route with this really insidious disease. And those core causes never got exposed in Karen's life. When I was doing the research, I could see where they lined up. I could see where, clinical causes of the disease could line up to details in her upbringing and in her life. But I don't think they were ever exposed in the biopic.
Do you think that Karen Carpenter's true story has been told?
I don't think Karen Carpenter's true story has really been told yet.